Hello, welcome to This Week in Politics. Well, today, as you saw in the introduction, there's two stories I want to take a look at. The first one is called Trump Takes A Thumpin, and the other one is about Socialism Is Revealed. Now, both of these stories have a rich history and show us what happens when corrupt people are in government. I took a risk by listing the titles and actually talking about what we reveal. We will see how that works out with the Facebook Nazis. When I go to boost this, see if we get blocked. But the first story I want to take a look at is Trump Takes a Thumpin. Now, before I get into telling you how he took a thumping, I think we should go over the history of what has been going on here. Now, since I think it's 2011, we have not passed a budget in this country. We keep governing by continuing resolutions. And what that means is the Congress just says, here's $1 trillion, you go spend it in each department as you see fit. No way that it is controlled, no guidelines, no projections, no income versus expenses, just here's the money, go do it. They did that last time, and Trump said, I'm not going to sign another continuing resolution. So this time, it came budget time. The House passed a continuing resolution, and the Senate passed it. And President Trump said, I told you I'm not passing a continuing resolution. If you want that signed so that 25% of the government can be funded, then I want money in this continuing resolution for a border wall. The Democrats all balked, said no. In fact, they put specific language in there that says you can have X amount of dollars for security, for border security, but you can't have any for the wall, which means they want to spend $5 billion on drones and cameras and all of that stuff, none of which is going to help. But that was what it was. So Trump said, okay, if you're not willing to pass a budget and you want to go with this continuing resolution, I'm not going to sign anything into law until I get money for the wall. The Democrats said no. Trump told everybody who was listening, I am willing to go all the way. I will not fund the government with this 25% until I get money for the wall. And if the rest of the government comes up for funding, I'm not going to fund that either. They can all go out and pound sand. The security of our country is more important. So 3 weeks later, after the press has hounded him, the polls looked like they were going the wrong way. 800,000 Americans were out of work. Trump buckled and he gave in. And here's what he gave in to. Chuck U. Schumer and Nancy Spitbucket Pelosi both told him, let's get the government back to work. Let's fund the government, and then we can talk about border security. So Trump signed it. They have no intention at all of discussing a wall. None at all. And Trump knew that. So the press is painting this as a loss They're painting this that Trump buckled. And right now, Trump is taking the thumping. But here's the advantage. There was a lot of airplay about Trump got the workers back to work. Okay. He signed it. They went back to work. So Trump gets credit for that. What he also gets credit for that the press isn't counting on is he also gets credit for, hey, I'm giving everybody a 3-week notice. One of two things is going to happen on February 15th. We're either going to have money secured for the wall, or everybody is going back out and nobody's going to get paid. And Chuck U. Schumer and Nancy Spit Bucket Pelosi know this. They're not even negotiating with Trump. So when the 3 weeks is up, Trump can very easily go to the people and say, I told everybody, and Chuck U. Schumer and Nancy Spit Bucket Pelosi would negotiate. It's on them. I did everything I could. I made 4 different offers. I told everybody in advance, and here we are. Right now, according to the Dems and the press and the left-wingers, everybody is saying that the Democrats won big time. And right now, it looks that way. If you projected 2 or 3 moves down the chessboard, it appears to me that Trump is playing the long game. They're playing the short game. So right now, they're winning, Trump is losing. Now, on February 15th, I used to think that I wanted Trump to declare a national emergency and just go build the damn wall. Here's the problem with that. We know that the Democrats will file an injunction order. They'll go to the Supreme Court. Now, if Trump wins there, great, we get the wall. If he doesn't win, not only do we not get the wall, but it is dead basically forever, because we have a conservative majority on the court, and if we lose big time. I'm not convinced we need to go all in. I think Trump will. I think he'll go all in. And frankly, the odds are probably 60-40. We win at the Supreme Court, but is 60-40 really worth it? I don't know. But even if we win, that takes up time. But as I said, Trump is playing the long game. And what if he doesn't declare an emergency and he goes the other way and he shuts the government down? Remember, I said a couple of weeks ago that this battle will be fought in the hearts and minds of Americans, not in the courts. I think up until this point, it was probably split 50-50 who was getting the blame. Chuck U. Schumer and Nancy Spitbucket Pelosi on one side, and Donald Trump on the other side. I think no matter how the press spins this on February 15th, I think Trump wins 75-25 because he told everybody in advance. He gave everybody notice. He gave them every opportunity to negotiate, which they will not do. Whose fault is it now that 800,000 people are out of work? And I'll tell you the truth, if I'm reading the tea leaves right, Chuck U. Schumer and Nancy Spitbucket Pelosi, they will not negotiate. They will let those people stay out of work for 2 years. They will not give in to Trump, and I think Trump knows that. But what does that do in 2020? I think that works big time against the Democrats. Donald Trump got elected to build that wall. And if he could pick out which party is standing in the way of that, I think they lose big time. So I think it's a big gamble. I think Chuck U. Schumer in the Senate and Nancy Spitbucket Pelosi in the House, they're playing a game that the odds of them winning are like 20%. I think long term, Trump has 80% chance of winning this. Short term, Trump is losing for sure. But that's all that the press and politicians know how to think. Trump plays the long game, not the short game. So that's how we got to where we are now. Now, let's talk about where we go from here. As I see it, we have three options. Option number one is we have a 25% of the government shutdown. We have 25%, which is 800,000 employees out of work. Some are working with no pay. The air traffic controllers is a major problem. And the longer that situation goes on, the worse it's going to be. Like I said, though, I think Trump will only get 25% of the blame, probably closer to 30 or 40, because the press will be hounding him and not pointing out the truth about the Congress. But still, I think Trump wins long term. Option number two is he declares a national emergency and gets the $5 billion he needs from the executive branch and continues building the wall. As I said earlier, the bad part about that is this. They will get a temporary injunction order, which means all building on the wall stops, which right now they are building, they're building. If they get an injunction order, that building stops, plus the building that Trump wants to increase stops. So that takes up time till it gets to the Supreme Court. If we went to the Supreme Court, great. Problem is, next year, they just won't allocate any money. We go down the same road. We play this game for the next 6 years, and the wall still doesn't get built. If we lose at the Supreme Court, the wall is dead permanently. This conversation is over. Trump doesn't get elected in 2020. We got a Democrat in the House, or Democrat in the White House, and it's all over. Option number three is we do nothing. February 15th comes, there's no negotiation, there's no bill, there's no options, and Trump does absolutely nothing. He does not declare a national emergency. He doesn't go before the American people. He doesn't do anything. It just sits there. Those are the three options that I see. The most likely option I see is a 25% government shutdown and a play for the hearts and minds of the American people, hoping that he wins that, and that Chuck U. Schumer and Nancy Spitbucket Pelosi buckle under the pressure. That's not going to happen. I don't see them buckling. Chuck and Nancy do not give two craps about 800,000 unemployed Americans. They don't care about Americans getting killed by illegal aliens. They don't care about the sex trafficking of children and women that are coming across our border. They don't care about MS-13 coming across and killing our people. They don't care about all the opioids coming across our border. They don't care about any of that. What they care about is the ones that come across and vote will vote Democrat, and that's all they care about. So let's say that scenario plays out. How does it look for 2020? Well, if the wall, now when I did a program on Donald Trump in 2016, I said succinctly, if 2020 comes and the wall is not being built and major progress being made, he will not get reelected. That's what he was elected for, build the wall. So the base will be unhappy, and his base is a conservative, evangelical Christians. They will be unhappy. The Republicans can't win without that base. Alternatively, the Democrats will be charged up because they finally stopped Trump. He doesn't get the wall. He loses. He doesn't get a victory. I mean, this is how they'll play it. So the Trumps win, or the Democrats win, Trump loses, and the Democrats ride a wave for the presidency and Congress and the Senate in 2020. God help us. Now, is there a possibility that no wall and Trump still wins? Possibly. Possibly, but that narrows considerably for several reasons. Number one, the swamp has not been emptied. He's made inroads. And an example I could give you is the 800,000 unnecessary, or whatever the term they're using is, government employees are out to work. They were out for 3 weeks and we did just fine. He needs to, this time, if he does that, he needs to go the full 30 days, then furlough 600,000 of them. Take 200,000 and bring them back. He just drained the swamp of 400,000 swamp dwellers. And that's what needs to happen. Then after he's able to drain that 25% of the swamp, or 70, let's see, he will have drained 66% of the 25% of the federal government swamp. Once that's done, then he can sign the continuing resolution, declare a national emergency, and then play that game. That way he wins both sides of that coin. And I think that's what I would do. On February 15th, when there's no agreement, I would let 25% of the government go unfunded, let the 800,000 go out on furlough. I would just sit there and wait until there's a law, by the way, that after 30 days, they can be fired, or furloughed, as they call them, with no consequence, no reason, no excuse. 30 days of not funding, they can be fired. So I'd wait the full 30 days. I might even wait 31 or 32 just to make sure. And then I'd fire 400 or 600,000 of the 800,000. And I'd have that coordinated with my department heads so that I got rid of 600,000 employees. Now, when the next continuing resolution comes up for the 75% of the government, I take the same stand. I wouldn't sign it. I'd let them go out on strike, and I'd get rid of 70% of them. I'd make the government work harder, better, and more efficient, and get rid of the dead weight, get rid of the swamp. That's the opportunity I see that Trump has. How he plays the hand remains to be seen. All right, that's what I wanted to say about that story. Now, the second story I want to talk about is Venezuela. Now, I did a couple of stories about 6 months ago when the troubles in Venezuela started happening. And when they started happening, and actually one of those programs was aimed at millennials, because millennials seem to be enthralled with socialism. And I think the reason they're enthralled is because they have been indoctrinated by our educational system. They think capitalism is bad, money is bad, power is bad. We should all be equal. It should all be fair. We should all hold hands and sing Kumbaya. And that's the message that Bernie Sanders and Cortez and Warren and all of these left-wing socialists are painting, and that is not how socialist works. Socialism has never worked ever, ever on the planet. There are still some socialist countries. Cuba is one. Venezuela is one. How are those countries doing? Now, I don't know if you know anything about Cuba or Venezuela, but I happen to know a little bit about both of them. I wouldn't send my worst enemy to live there. The prison where we send terrorists is Gitmo, and that's on Cuba. There's a reason that base is on Cuba. And it's not because they have a Holiday Inn every 3 blocks. Now, just a little bit of history, not much. Venezuela used to be in the top 4 or 5 powerful financial countries in the world. Definitely number 2 in this hemisphere, bar none. They have the second highest oil reserves on this continent. Their standard of living was higher than anybody else on this continent, with the exception of the United States. Then they elected Hugo Chavez. Now remember, this country mirrors the United States very closely. We're the dominant power in the world. Venezuela was a dominant power on this continent, with the exception of us. They started flirting around with socialism and they elected Hugo Chavez. This country currently is flirting around with socialism, and everybody that's been thrown their hat into the ring so far on the Democratic side is socialist. So the left is flirting with socialism, just like Venezuela did 10 or 12 years ago when they elected Hugo Chavez. Chavez died. He handpicked Maduro. In the period of that time, Venezuela has become totally bankrupt. A wheelbarrow full of money will not buy you anything because it's not available. The grocery stores are not filled with food. The oil companies are not producing near the oil they should. The government is not responding with anything but force and power. The leaders of that country have raped, pillaged, and plundered that economy to where all of the money is gone, and there's nothing there to even stock the grocery stores for the people. The people are so hungry and so desperate, they're killing stray dogs and pet dogs to eat for food. The average Venezuela has lost 30 pounds in the last 12 months. The last election that Maduro was involved in, if I have my numbers right, won 98% of the vote, which was all a sham. That was all a rigged election, which is what socialists do. Look back at the 2016 election. Hillary Clinton and the Democratic National Convention had that election rigged on the Democratic side so that Bernie had no chance. I maintained then, and I maintain now, if they had played that game fair, Bernie Sanders would have kicked her butt, and I'm afraid that he probably would have beaten Donald Trump. So that's the state of where things are. Their currency is worth nothing. Now, there is a leader down there that they had the election for, and the United States has stepped in and said that he is the legitimate president and Maduro needs to go. All of the democratic nations around the world have endorsed that. Guess which countries are backing Maduro? Iran, Turkey, and Russia. Those 3 countries are behind them. That ought to tell you a little something. So anyway, there was an in-depth there were several in-depth articles in the Wall Street Journal this last Friday, and I want to go over one of them. And the headline reads, Venezuela's military says it backs Maduro. Now, I want to go over this article, and this will give you a good backdrop. And if you are a millennial, or if you know any millennials, I really wish you would copy this program and paste it so that they can see it. Venezuela's military threw its support behind embattled President Nicolas Maduro on Thursday, dealing a significant blow to the U.S. effort to back a parallel government and oust the authoritarian leader. One of the things, okay, there are basically two things that a socialist government needs to survive. Number one is a government-run press, which the Democrats have, and a compliant military. Fortunately, our government leaders were smart enough in the beginning not to allow that to happen. They are separate, and they do not have to back the president if he is in the wrong. Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino, flanked by the heads of the country's armed forces, said the military would oppose any effort to remove Mr. Maduro, who began his second six-year term this month after elections last year that were widely regarded as a sham. He ended his speech with shouts of Chavez Vive, a reference to the late socialist strongman Hugo Chavez. Well, of course he did. He's the one that put him in power. Juan Guaido, a 35-year-old lawmaker who was recognized by the U.S. and other countries on Wednesday as the country's legitimate president, formally asked the U.S. for emergency humanitarian aid to ease shortages of food and medicine. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said the U.S. is ready to provide $20 million in assistance as soon as logistically possible. I'm not a politician, I'm not a government agent, but what that answer says to me is as soon as Maduro is gone, we'll give you the $20 million in food. The move by Mr. Guaido, who has gone from little-known legislator to the face of a swelling opposition movement within weeks, is aimed at building support for a parallel government among ordinary Venezuelans. So he's trying to do down there what Obama is trying to do here in the United States, run a parallel government or secret government. Most Western democracies back Mr. Guaido, along with multilateral financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund. Mexico, Uruguay, and some European governments called for dialogue. Russia, China, Turkey, and Cuba lined up to support Mr. Maduro. Moscow blamed the U.S. for provoking the political crisis in the oil-rich Latin American country, where Moscow risks losing billions of dollars in trade and military investment. So we see right off of the bat that one of the reasons that Russia is backing this guy is they've got billions of dollars at risk. The United States could care less about the trade they do with Venezuela. What we care about is we do not want socialism to flourish. Russ Allen, director of the Caracas Capital Markets Investment Bank, said Venezuela owes $20 billion to China. It owes $3.15 billion to the Russian government for arms purchased, and another $3.1 billion to Rosneft, a state-controlled oil firm. Mr. Guaido is also offering amnesty to military officers who support his rival government. Exiled former officers and opposition leaders are working to persuade officers to proclaim their recognition of Mr. Guaido, but not to remove Mr. Maduro by force, an exiled former top Venezuelan military official said. The guys who have the guns matter. That's what being a de facto leader means, said James Bosworth, head of Latin America risk consulting company. And that's what separates America from the rest of the countries in the world. most of the countries and all of the socialists and all of the communist governments all maintain their power through military. And they all maintain that power because the people have no guns and no arms. That's why the Second Amendment was so important. Our forefathers knew that. The government cannot roll over us as long as we're armed. If they try to come and take our guns or tell us what to do, all we have to do is defend ourselves, and that's constitutional. People in Venezuela don't have that. People in Cuba don't have that because the government has the guns and the people don't. Venezuela's army has long played a key role in politics. A military coup in 47 ousted a democratically elected president and led to a military dictatorship until another coup in 58 paved the way for restoration of democracy. Mr. Chavez, a former Army paratrooper, led a failed coup attempt in 92, and after he was elected president, his rivals attempted a coup in 02, but were quickly thwarted by a combination of street protests and allies in the army who rallied to Mr. Chavez and returned him to the presidential palace after a brief detention. Now they did that because it was the heady days of socialism, and every socialist country goes through this. As long as there's enough of other people's money to fulfill the promises, everybody's great. Like they're claiming here in the United States. If the whole country got free medical care and free tuition and free housing and free cars, and then everybody's fine. But here's the problem. At some point, the government runs out of other people's money. And then what happens is what's happening in Venezuela. The government doesn't have the money to put food on the shelves. And I've seen this played out in many, many countries. One of the deciding factors of why the USSR failed. They run out of money to supply the basic needs of the people. And yet, the leaders in these socialist and communist countries continue to become very, very, very wealthy. Unfortunately, the obvious outcome is all of the money goes to the top 1%, and then everybody else is poor and broke and driving 1950s cars. Look at Cuba. Mr. Guaido's bid for power and the international backing it has received is a significant development in Venezuela's crisis, but many analysts said it will be difficult to dislodge Mr. Maduro as long as he enjoys military support. And that is true. Now, from the United States point of view, a military action, much like Reagan did with the Panamanian leader, you go in there, get out, throw him into jail, that's an option, a good option. England did that in, I can't remember the name of the islands. They had dominance over some islands in South America, and they did that too. In a speech on Wednesday, Mr. Maduro lavished praise on the military as green-clad troops cheered and waved a Venezuelan flag from a nearby rooftop. Mr. Maduro asked his audience to give a round of applause for our armed forces, who are always loyal and never traitorous. To him. The article doesn't say that. He didn't say that, but that's to him, they're loyal, not to the people. Since Venezuela's economy began its collapse in 2014, Mr. Maduro has essentially ruled along with the military. He has at least 10 active duty or former generals as cabinet ministers, and the army runs everything from oil state firm Petrolas de Venezuela to mining and food imports. So that's how he bribed the military. Here, I'll give you the oil industry and I'll give you the mining industry, and the rest of the government gets all the other businesses, and the people are just screwed. So of course the military is going to back him. They have every financial interest. And I don't know this for a fact, but I'm willing to bet you that the military people in the military live very, very well. Several key military figures, including the Interior Minister, General Nestor Reverol, the former head of the National Guard, and retired General Hugo Caraval, former head of military intelligence, have been indicted by the U.S. for drug trafficking. Others have been punished for corruption and human rights abuses. No surprise, when the money starts to run out, and these people aren't making hundreds of millions of dollars every year, now they go to illegal ways to make the money. And that's where Russia is. They are a combination socialist democracy. And the oligarchs are sucking up all the money. So now they're going, when that runs out, and because of the actions the United States has taken, they're going to start doing illegal things like helping Iran build their nuclear power against the wishes of the United States by funding and by stealing, basically, the uranium from the United States with the help of the Clintons. During Mr. Chavez's time in power, he politicized the military, making sure promotions were contingent on loyalty to him and Bolivarian sociology ideology. In 2008, Mr. Chavez made the military adopt the Cuban-derived motto Patria, Socialismo o Muerte Venceremos, or Fatherland Socialism or Death, we will triumph. That same year, the military was renamed the National Bolivarian Armed Force, making clear its ideological identification. The Venezuelan military is also thoroughly penetrated by Cuba's intelligence services. Military officials said, those who might revolt against Mr. Maduro face a persuasive intelligence unit overseen by Cuban military advisors, which has snuffed out numerous plots current and former officers set. Now notice that Venezuela didn't go to any other South American country. They went to Cuba. Why do you think that is? Because the Cuban leaders, the Castros, have managed to keep that whole island under subjection since 1959. They are dirt poor. The only cars they have are cars that were there at the time. The only food and assistance they get are from other communist countries. The only people that are living high on the hog are the Castros and the people that help them keep in power, which is probably the military. So when Maduro wants to do that in his country, same government setup, needs to stay in power, and he wants to do it long term, who does he call on? People that have been doing it long term. The Cubans come over, help them do that, and here's where we are. The people are starving. There's no food in the grocery store. But guess what? That's exactly the way it is in Cuba. Why is anybody surprised? In his 6 years in office, Mr. Maduro has put intelligence officers in each unit, stripped pensions and benefits for families of officers accused of plotting, and thrown some in jail. It's very hard to organize a coup in Venezuela, said Harold Trincunas, a Venezuelan expert at Stanford University. The military is divided, corrupt, compromised, and closely watched. Still, the coordinated recognition of Mr. Guaido as a true president by the U.S. and others, coupled with massive demonstrations, is meant to ratchet up the pressure on the military, some analysts said. The U.S. has sought an emergency United Nations Security Council meeting on Saturday to discuss the Venezuelan situation. The council isn't expected to take action, but will debate the situation and the legitimacy of the government. And here's why the UN sucks, that we need to get out of it. The UN is run by a bunch of pot-bellied dictators. Guess what Maduro is? He's a pot-bellied dictator. If the US backs somebody else, guess what the UN is going to do? First off, they're going to put off addressing this issue as long as possible. When they do finally address it, and like they said, action is not expected, but we'll talk it to death. And in the end, they're going to do nothing. So if anything is going to be, any force is going to be taken to remove Maduro from office, the United States is going to have to do it. The UN is going to do nothing. Speaking at a special meeting of the Organization of American States in Washington on Thursday, Mr. Pompeo called on Western Hemisphere countries to back Mr. Guaido. Tens of thousands of Venezuelans have taken to the streets to demand Mr. Maduro's resignation in the most meaningful opposition protest since 2017, when at least 124 people were killed, nearly all by security forces. At least 7 people were killed and more than 350 arrested in the unrest on Wednesday, according to Foro Penal, a Venezuelan governmental organization. The streets were calm on Thursday. Okay. Another socialist government or communist government is that of Syria. Okay. Where we've had the United States bombing, Russia bombing, the Syrian government bombing and using gas on its people. These guys are not going to leave peacefully. They will, if they want Maduro gone, they can exert all the pressure they want. Maduro and his leaders and the military are living fine. Life is good for them. They don't care about the people in the streets. If they get too close, they'll kill them. That is the sign of governments, socialist governments around the world. Same with the Castros. Same with the USSR. Same with Putin and the oligarchs. Same with Erdogan. All of these governments that are strongman led, they do not care about the people. So for these countries like the United States to think that the people are going to exert pressure that means nothing to them, all they have to do is gas them or kill them. There is evidence of at least some opposition to Mr. Maduro within the military. This week, 24 low-ranking National Guard members attacked a Caracas military outpost but were soon overwhelmed and arrested. In previous bouts of unrest, the Venezuelan government has been careful to keep the army out of the streets. Instead, the government has relied on armed and masked paramilitary forces, national police, and the country's National Guard. Containing unrest without widespread bloodshed could prove difficult in a country where economic output has fallen by 1/2 during the past 6 years. Hyperinflation has ravaged earning power and annihilated savings, and chronic shortages have led to widespread hunger and an exodus so far of some 3 million Venezuelans. So 3 million Venezuelans have left. Economic output has been cut in half. Hyperinflation means a wheelbarrow full of the Venezuelan dollar couldn't buy a loaf of bread. That's the situation they're in. That's what socialism is. And that's where it always goes to. Always, always, always. The point at which the people with guns who can't feed their families outnumber people with guns who can feed their families, that's a tipping point, Mr. Bosworth said. Absolutely it is. And let me read that again. I want you to pay attention. The point at which the people with guns who can't feed their families outnumber people with guns who can feed their families, that's a tipping point. So what he's saying is the people that are rioting in the streets don't have guns right now. The people that the military and the government, they have guns. If that changes, that's going to be the tipping point. Then Maduro and the government will have to go. Because if they don't, the people who have guns that can't feed their families will storm the palace and kill everybody in there. Now, why did I pick that story? That story is relevant, not because I care about Venezuela. I know very little about Venezuela, but I know a lot about socialism. And I know what's going on here in this country. And I know that the election of 2020 is coming in. I also know that the millennials in this country have a romanticized view of socialism and communism because they want it to be fair. They want everybody to be equal. They don't want power to be the center. They don't want control to be an issue. They want us all to hold hands, sing kumbaya, and we all have equal things. That has never worked. It will never work, never has worked. But that's how they've been indoctrinated by our education system. I hope that the millennials are paying attention. I hope they listen to this program. I hope they take a close look at Venezuela. Don't take my word for it. Go down, if you want to, go down to Venezuela, take a look. Look at the newscast, Google it. Inform yourself of what's going on in Venezuela, what was going on in Venezuela before Hugo Chavez, and compare that to where Venezuela is now. Because that comparison will compare very, very similarly to where we are now and 10 years from now if socialism ever takes hold in this country. Well, that's a program this week, everybody. I think that's all I want to say about that. Just a couple of announcements. This program and all the programs that we do are financed by the Prayer Box Ministry. If you'd like to know a little bit more about who we are and what we do, you can go to prayerboxministry.org. That's O-R-G. There's a lot to do over there. We like to say you can do one thing every day, 7 days a week for 7 years and never repeat what you're doing. That's a lot of stuff. So go over there and check us out, prayerboxministry.org. Well, you all have a blessed week. I look forward to next week when we can sit down and talk about this week in politics.